just to remind you, Timmy, and so I'm a former legislator as well, a member of the Vermont State University faculty, and the chair of the board as well. I've authored a few pieces of legislation that didn't really get to the finish line on the cannabis. Representative Rennie Cushing, before he passed, asked me to chair the House Cannabis Caucus for the Democrats in 2019. I expanded that to both sides of the aisle for the other 3 years I was in the House. I also work as a media consultant for the Cannabis Certification Council. They're a Denver-based sustainability organization for the cannabis industry. So, John, if you want to give us a little bit of a who you are as candidate, and obviously tie it to cannabis, and then we have a bunch of questions which we sent you, and we'll go from there.
Cool. I think I can answer most of your questions in my general spiel. So I've been living in New Hampshire my whole life. I've been running a little restaurant since 2015, Johnny Boston's International, which is in Newmarket. And basically, as soon as I bought the building, I got involved with local politics, got in the ZBA, Energy Environment Committee, eventually the town council. And I just come to realize that there's a number of systemic issues in the state that are limiting my business's ability to grow. Primarily, there's not a lot of parking, and there's no money for parking because of the way that we pay for our schools. So this led me down a rabbit hole to where I realized the only, it seems wild, but really the only way for me to get my platform out there was to run for governor. I could not afford to run for or serve as a state rep or a senator because they only get paid $100 a year. As a result, most people like me are not in Concord. You know, there's a disproportionate number of wealthy and retired people up there. I think it's roughly 80%. And I think that probably also reflects our cannabis legislation or lack thereof as well, as it does affect, I think, all of the issues of the working class, housing, opioid crisis, education funding, et cetera, et cetera. So, cannabis was definitely top of mind for me when I got into this race and legalizing it. And I've had a lot of conversations with people that have been working to legalize it over the years. So basically, I came up with a plan that I think will please, I hope, all of the people. And that's part of sort of why I added certain parts, was to please particularly the Republican Senate. Let's be honest. They're likely to be in a majority, hopefully not as, maybe the Dems will pull off a win. I'm not, I'm thinking about the current legislators as they sit. Let's just say that. So my plan is basically the way that I think we should do it. And again, I'm totally, this is an evolving plan. I'm not married to any one aspect of this. If somebody thought that changing one part or another would make it more likely to pass, to me, that's the goal. So what I would like to see happen is, so the two things I heard the Republicans saying was that they did not want an infinite number of cannabis shops. That seemed to be an issue for them. And the other one being, they wanted the state to have some control over it or be making some of the tax revenue. So what I would like to see created is a separate authority, sort of a New Hampshire cannabis authority that would not be, really run by the state. It would be a private entity, public-private partnership that would sell cannabis in a similar model to the Liquor Commission, potentially using places where we already have liquor stores. At the same time, I would like to see the current medicinal shops be able to transition into a recreational shop and then also make a profit. Right now, as you know, they're a nonprofit. The other thing I'd like to see is sort of what I would call a farmer's market permit for someone that wanted to sort of grow. And again, these numbers, I'm just making them up, 25 plants or whatever poundage per year. That would be, not like a massive operation. And then basically the big thing is that I would like to see the proceeds from the sale of cannabis going into housing. And this is important because obviously we need revenue for housing. This is a huge problem. It's probably, I would say, the number one problem in the state, but it really changes the equation for people who don't care about cannabis. If I say to them, if we do this and legalize it, it'll give us, some money to get homeless people off the street, et cetera, et cetera. That is enough for people that are on the sidelines to say, hey, I would be in favor of it if it meant that there would be less homeless people in New Hampshire. So that's kind of where that part of it, I think, is important, is to talk about what the revenue is going to do. but to also be serious about the fact that we're not talking about billions of dollars. We're not talking about enough money to lower anybody's property taxes. But the thing with housing is that we can leverage the money in the sense that we could loan it out in the form of, loans to developers who are going to build the type of housing that we need in the various places that we need it. So the money could be like a loan fund that would be building, over time as it's getting paid back. There's a really similar, there's a model that I'm sort of been looking at a lot, which is the New Hampshire Business Finance Authority. I don't know if you guys know about them, but they've got a really interesting model. And I think we could do something like that with housing. It's just a matter of where we get kind of the initial loan fund from, which I think cannabis would be a great source. And yeah, I mean, that's basically it. And again, I'm open. Obviously, this is really in many ways aspirational. What gets through the legislature, I'm sure, will be much different. But I think that this general outline pleases as many people as possible, I guess, in hopes. And the other thing too that some of the Democrats have pointed out is they want some way to sort of the argument, I get it, that the state has been locking people up for cannabis for decades. How can they then turn around and sell it? So I would say some portion of the money should go to restitution payments for anyone that's done, substantial prison time for selling or possessing cannabis. Other states have tried to give dispensary licenses to people that were served time. And from my research, that has not always worked out that well, because you've got somebody that was used to selling cannabis in an underground model, and then all of a sudden they have to come up with $1 million to open a cannabis shop. And a lot of them in New York, I've heard, are basically just selling their licenses for $100,000. So my thought is, cut out the middleman, just give them a check for $100,000 or whatever, whatever we deem to be the, adequate amount of money. I mean, and basically, I feel like this way we could prevent basically out-of-state cannabis industry from just coming in and completely taking over. And again, even with the housing piece of this, if we in the rules were to say, this money is going to go towards housing until the average rent gets below or at 30% of an average income, then we could do something else with that money. It's really just kind of a midterm goal. I think that we could then, and then if we wanted to expand the number of dispensaries at a later date, sure, I'd be open to that. And even if at some point we said, okay, the state's not going to sell cannabis anymore, we're going to transition entirely to a free market system, I'd be fine with that. I just think we need to sort of come up with something that will get over the, get past, and then, that pleases as many people as possible. And then, as the legislature potentially changes, tweak that model where it would please even more people.
Well, I'll start with Jim in a second, but I just do want to commend John. His website is the only one that actually has a cannabis policy front and center on his website. So I want to make sure I say that to all on board. Let's dig in a little bit, Jim. I think you've somewhat, like you said, John, you've answered some of the questions, but let's dig in a little bit. Jim, do you want to go ahead with your question?
Yeah, well, thanks. And I've worked all my life in agricultural policy and promoting the needs of farmers. And I guess I really like your idea of a farmers market permit system. But I don't know how compatible that is with the state monopoly model on the other side for the commercial market. But I guess I'd like a little more information. What kind of numbers are you looking at, limits on those permits, but also more important to me is your position on home grow, both medical and just general home grow.
Yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned that too. I definitely think we should allow home grow. I don't know how many plants or whatever, and all those sort of numbers I'm open to discussion on. I got a friend who lives in South Berwick, Maine, and it's kind of funny because he's got a bunch of plants growing in his front yard. And I said to him one time, I said, are you worried about like the local neighbors, your local like teenagers stealing your weed? It's in a shed that's not locked up or anything. And he said, look out my back window. And I could see his plants, and then his neighbor's plants, and then the other neighbor's plants. And I don't really think personally that, well, first of all, growing cannabis is really hard. And I think a lot of people think they're going to just throw some seeds in the ground and then, all of a sudden there's going to be free weed everywhere. That's just, I know from personal experience, that's not how it works. So I think that of all the people that even get into trying to grow it, you will end up with a very small number that end up with any quantity of good cannabis. But I think that should definitely be, allowed. I don't see that being an issue at all. And in terms of, the state selling it, the way that I think about it is in terms of as an entrepreneurial, way for the state to make money out of people from Massachusetts. So how could we take, particularly like the liquor stores on 95 and 93, where you have people from Massachusetts stopping every summer to buy a bunch of liquor to go to their lake house or whatever. And if the cannabis was slightly cheaper than Massachusetts and particularly slightly better, you have them going and buying it there, from a like I said, state public-private authority, just that we could kind of recoup some of the money that's been going south for the last, number of years.
I have a quick follow-up question of how do you think the cannabis could be better here? It just seems that we've kind of driven out a lot of the talented cultivators and the people who are passionate about this because we haven't had a legal market. So a lot of people have gone to Maine and Massachusetts and Vermont. So how can we incentivize good growers to come here and contribute to our market?
That's a really good question. And honestly, I had not thought about that at all. I'll have to think about that because it's a really good point. I mean, I know a lot of farmers in New Hampshire, produce farmers, not cannabis farmers. And I obviously I've known a lot of people that have grown cannabis over the years, and I've been to the dispensaries and stuff in Massachusetts and Maine, but I have not thought as much about that aspect of it because I just wasn't sure if it was something that your run-of-the-mill produce farmer is then going to want to add on, because I thought that would be a good way of sort of helping out the agriculture industry that is obviously has such a hard time in New Hampshire. But I've been meaning to talk to some of my farmer friends about this. I don't know if it's so far out of their wheelhouse that it's not worth the effort for them because it is such a completely different thing than growing tomatoes. But I think there probably is some farmers that would say, hey, if I could grow cannabis, it's going to make the rest of my whole operation more profitable. And I'm like definitely interested in using this to prop up New Hampshire's agriculture any way we can.
And Phil, I know you have, thank you. Sorry. You good, Riley? Phil,
Oh yeah, I was just saying thank you for that.
I know you have a thought, and I was going to go to your question next because it's thematically in sort of agriculture. So go ahead, Phil.
Oh, you're muted, Phil.
Thank you very much. Just a comment on that last conversation. One way to think about that question about how do you get people from Massachusetts to buy New Hampshire, I think baked into the whole situation, if you're promoting, as we do in Vermont, craft cannabis, like we have craft beer. People come to New Hampshire from Massachusetts and New York might be thinking, as I would, even though I grow my own, I come from Vermont. If I go to New Hampshire, I might want to buy the New Hampshire cannabis because that's grown locally. That's the craft cannabis. And Vermont, and we're seeing this in Vermont. Everybody says the word has gone out. Buy local, don't buy from the two bigger cannabis companies in Vermont. And those two companies are severely struggling because the word is out. People are buying local. But anyway,
great.
back to my question, which has to do with a little bit with my comment, trying to find it, when I was introducing myself as an educator. And I'll just read it since you probably have it. And it goes, most states which have legalized adult marijuana have debated the question of the limits on THC content. While this seems to be a simple enough issue, in fact, it's quite complicated, especially given the generally high THC content of most commercial marijuana today, the high THC levels that medical users may require, and other considerations. And so my question is, what is your position on this? And this gets back to my point about lack of information, a lot of what I call marijuana myths that are still out there. This has a little bit to do with one of my pet peeves, the comment that, this is not your grandfather's marijuana, which is really not true. But that's probably going to come up in New Hampshire. We must have THC limits because marijuana is so much higher than it's ever been before. So I'm just curious as to your comment on that.
Yeah, the only thing I have had people express some sort of concern about is the really high THC dabs. I don't know what the clinical term is for that, but you know, that's like literally 70 or percent THC, like really high. And you know, I don't know how much this has been studied, but this seems to be linked with at least a few instances of cannabis-induced psychosis. And I know that I've heard at least from people just that, and maybe again, this is the media playing this up. I don't know enough about it, but you know, in the same way that when you walk into the liquor store, every bottle's not 100% alcohol, you know, and you wouldn't want that, you know. So I think that, you know, we should look at the limits potentially on the higher end, and the way that it's consumed, I think, is actually potentially more dangerous when it's that high heat, the concentrated oil. I don't think, and I could be wrong, but I don't think with sort of normal cannabis plants, you can get the THC high enough for it to really be dangerous to anybody. But I have just heard anecdotal stories about, you know, and it's mainly teenagers. I think it's that whole brain still growing, and they're, you know, the problem with the vapes and stuff is that because there's no smoke, you can just do it all the time, you know, and the kids are sitting there. I mean, I quit smoking a while ago, but in between quitting smoking cigarettes, I was vaping. And the one problem with it is because I didn't have to leave my apartment, you can just sort of do it like all the time. And it becomes this thing where you're not really thinking about it. So that's just the one pushback that I've gotten from the general public. I had a woman come up to me on Saturday in Stratford and said, I had 2 relatives in my family, you know, suffer from, you know, cannabis-induced psychosis, blah, blah, blah. And so that was kind of what I said to her was, you know, like in the same way that every bottle of liquor is not 100% alcohol, you know, we would treat cannabis the same way. But again, I'm totally science and data driven, not anecdotal story. So I was sort of looking for more research on that to ensure that that was not, you know, media hype.
I do think that's a similar situation as alcohol, in the sense that maybe your beer and your wine is more like smoking flower, where it's a lower percentage and less effects. But you can also buy liquor that gets you really messed up, and people have done really dangerous things under the influence of liquor as well.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily the role of the government to control vices, which we know because nicotine and liquor are fully available everywhere, right? Yeah. I'm someone who uses dabs, and a lot of my friends also use dabs. Typically use very, very small amounts. You're not taking these huge, massive amounts of oil. So the actual relative amount of THC you're putting in your body is pretty similar between smoking a full gram joint of high THC flower compared to taking a small dab of a higher THC concentrate. So I think dabs are really misunderstood, but they are an amazing therapeutic tool for so many people, especially people with chronic pain that need kind of that higher percentage but lower amount of things entering their lungs, because dabbing is technically a form of vaporization, which has been shown to be healthier than smoking. So it's also technically a harm reduction tool depending on the lens that you're looking at it, but most people tend to look at it through a negative lens.
Can I just say very quickly, because I know we have a lot of other questions. Frankly, John, I think I heard a couple of these marijuana myths I'm talking about. For example, in relation to youth, you know, one of the questions is, once we legalize marijuana, it's going to be a dramatic spike among young people, adolescents, and teens smoking marijuana. In fact, just the opposite has happened. You know, there's been a decline. So when a woman like that says, you know, I'm worried about the youth, you say, well, actually, once we legalize, it's much more difficult for young people to get it. The numbers are down. Also, you know, I always give Exhibit A to the grandfather comment that, you know, for more than 2,000 years, humans have made hashish, right, which can be anywhere from 30 to 80% THC. That they've been using that for thousands of years.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's like one of the original. What's one of the original concentrates, right? And as
I didn't know that THC that high. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, and as to you know, psychotic breaks using cannabis, you know, even that has been debunked. You know, people who are prone to psychosis, you know, maybe should be a little bit careful. You know, that marijuana might trigger the psychosis, but it's not causing psychosis among people who don't already have psychosis. So that's another one of those myths that's out there that, you know, you're going to hear all the time, and I just think there's some, you know, greater facts to support to challenge those.
I have found it's really hard to convince people that the teen use that has gone down. Because when I tell them, I'm like, I looked that up too, and I was like, teen rates actually go down in states that legalize. They just are like, they just don't believe it. I mean, and I've also tried to make the argument like, I mean, I think this is true of all drugs. Is drugs belong in the doctor's office or whatever, and not in the hands of drug dealers. And that's the argument I've tried to make to some of these parents that by regulating it, we can control it more. Obviously there's probably going to be some sort of black market at all times, but at least we know the supply is good and clean, if you will.
Right. Yeah, I have two quick comments and then we'll get Daryl's question. I can send you, if you want, the CDC study that says every state where cannabis has been legalized, underage use has gone down. And my comment to anyone that talks about the black market says, I always say, we're a capitalist nation. There's a black market for every industry. I like to joke, I like to make this
It'll
joke,
never die.
but it's not a joke, is you can go to Manhattan and you can buy anything you want at any time of the day. So that being said, Daryl, your question?
You're muted.
You're muted.
I pulled a Phil. So yeah, you pretty much answered the question in terms of structures. I mean, we had a complete state, running the dispensaries, being the business. We kind of had that same thing by proxy with the franchise. We've had agency model, free market model. So I'm not going to press you too much on that, but instead, kind of a conversation that I think will be helpful for you is the debate has always been centered around supply. And I think that the misconception with a lot of legislators is that they believe that the status quo is limiting supply to people they don't want to have it or negative outcomes that they perceive will happen. The truth is we now have 3 markets serving the state of New Hampshire. We've got the illicit market, we have the medicinal market, and we have the legal market on every border. And so what this is really about, I think, is economic opportunity. So I guess I would say, within what you're trying to do, how would you maximize economic opportunity in what we perceive as one of the most accessible portions of the market, retail, right? You don't have to be an agricultural expert or chemist. If you're going to have the state with their hands so deep into the operations of those dispensaries, and basically they may or may not be either running them or running them by proxy.
Yeah. So the way that I was envisioning it was the state would operate some shops that were sort of like the duty free at the airport, right? Where you go in there and it's cheaper and, there's a lot of different types of alcohol. That said, when you leave the airport, you can just go to a store and buy liquor. I mean, depending on where country you're in or what state. So I was not thinking of the dispensaries that exist right now as medicinal, that would become recreational. I was not envisioning the state having, I was envisioning the state having less control over them than they have now. That being a more free market, but appeasing, and then maybe we add a certain number every year or something to appease the Republicans' fear of having, the marijuana mile like they see in Maine. I mean, this is verbatim what I've heard from somebody that was on from Jared Sullivan, a state rep. He said verbatim, they literally just don't want a bunch of tacky weed shops in their towns. And he said the same, he was like, basically it's the same reason that they don't want public sale of liquor, as they think liquor stores are tacky. I mean, it comes down to something as kind of stupid and basic as that. But I think we sort of have to deal with people the way they are right now. I don't think we're going to change their minds. So that's where I was seeing, in terms of the state running some cannabis shops, it not being like hundreds, it being like 4 or 5, right? And targeting these shops to places where people from Massachusetts are going to go, basically. And then having, most of us New Hampshire residents would just go to your local dispensary rather than having to get on 95, go down, and I mean, yeah. So, I mean, there's another interesting thing that they did in Oklahoma that I found out recently. I'm sure you guys all know this, but, somebody came to my restaurant. They started telling me about how, there's a lot of pot in Oklahoma. And they're like, oh, yeah, we call it Smokelahoma. I'm like, what are you talking about? And they basically just made it so that you can get a medical permit for any ailment whatsoever. So everybody has them, which I thought was really a clever way of avoiding, a whole part of the argument. But I just bring that up to say the plan as I see it will definitely be changed. Obviously, we know this. So I'm kind of giving what I think would be my ideal, plan. Within that, it's probably going to look way different at the end. If the Republicans were to say, hey, we're down with a full, privatization model, I would totally support that. With the tax revenue going into housing. I think that's crucial just because, one, if you split it up into too many pots, it's not going to do anything. And two, if you can tell people that aren't, as I said before, people that aren't cannabis users, they get on board when it's like a really direct solution to problem. I also think if we wrote the rules right, we could keep the money from going into the general fund and being spent to lower taxes for rich people. And I think there's actually a way where we legally would have to do that, because if the state authority is, if this, state agency, state authority is taking in this money, maybe it can't even go into the general fund because of the federal prohibition. Maybe it has to be in its own fund that is run. So I was even thinking about an idea like, what if it was the New Hampshire Cannabis and Housing Authority, right? And they're literally writing the checks for the housing so that the guys in Concord, 4 or 5 years down the line can't say, oh, this money that was going to go towards housing, we're going to use it to cut taxes for our rich buddies. Because one interesting fact is the Liquor Commission, years and years and years ago, they decided they're going to put 5% of the profits into rehabilitation for people with, substance abuse problems. And every year they stole that money to balance the budget. And only in 2024, after 20 years of opioid crisis, do they now claiming that they're going to put the money into rehab. And I think we know they cannot be trusted. So in a way, I'm sort of trying to come up with this mechanism that keeps the money going into something that we want, as opposed to lowering taxes or frankly going into profits from out-of-state companies that are not really going to benefit New Hampshire anyway.
Yeah, so I think you're onto something there. And I've always said, I don't have any objection to the government competing in the industry as long as they're not, doing anything untowards or that's not fair. And Jim, I think you had mentioned once, like just a wholesale expansion of medical, and let's be done with it. One thing I will share that we learned, because we did try to talk to some, governmental, municipal, whatever type agencies. And so housing is an issue here. I come from the North Country. It's definitely an issue up there as well. And it was shared with us that water and sewer expansion as a precursor to that was a big issue. And that's why we tried to apply some funds to that in HB 1633. And then there was another organization, Tim, I don't remember the name, but they actually, I think, guaranteed certain parts of loan for developers to then build on that water sewer expansion to build the housing. So just some thoughts there, if it's anything that might help your platform, because we can get all the developers we want, but if we don't have them, water sewer, they're kind of stuck. So
yeah,
all good stuff. Thank you.
So, John, I have a question, and then there's 3 questions from our board members who couldn't make it. So mine is a little more, so now that we know, that this is a viable industry and New Hampshire is aging, right? Our median age of our residents is at 60. Do you believe that legalized recreational cannabis can allow for New Hampshire to attract and retain a younger workforce or more diverse professionals to add to that workforce?
I think it definitely will be a good factor. I think really, and well, honestly, if we spend the money on housing, yes, the housing is really the crucial piece that all of these other things really do not function without. People talk to me about, oh, we need to attract more companies with good paying jobs. They're not going to come here if there aren't a bunch of 20 and 30-year-olds to work. And there won't be a bunch of 20 and 30-year-olds to work if they can't find housing. I mean, right now, over 50% of graduating seniors from high school in New Hampshire leave the state. A lot of them go to college outside of New Hampshire because of the high tuition, and they do not come back. Meanwhile, like you said, the fastest growing demographic is 65 and up, which grew 50% from 2011 to 2021. And really, the demographics and the housing are sort of just linked up. And this is where, the cannabis, I think, could help both of those. I talked to somebody that's working for Dean Kamen over in, Manchester, and he's trying to attract, young people to move to Manchester to work for him. And he's literally just building restaurants and breweries, just trying to get people in. And I can only imagine that a healthy cannabis culture would help in that too. And I mean, we haven't talked about this, but I am definitely, I mean, I'm probably not going to bring this up a lot now, but I think down the line we should have cannabis cafes. I don't see any reason why we couldn't treat cannabis exactly the same way, liquor is treated. And any argument against cannabis, frankly, liquor is worse every single time, I mean, funny fact, several years ago, the Liquor Commission sent out a letter to everyone with a liquor license and said, hey, just so you know, you're not allowed to add CBD to beer. You can sell CBD products, but you can't add it to the alcohol yourself. Like, that's illegal. But they said, and just so you know, cannabis and CBD are really bad for your liver, which I thought was rich coming from the Liquor Commission. But I think it just goes to show that like their whole model is just really corrupt. I mean, one of the things I got into this initially to do was I wanted to get rid of the Liquor Commission completely. But I looked at the budget and I'm like, geez, they bring in so much money. It would be impossible to eliminate the Liquor Commission without proposing a sales or income tax, which is never going to get me elected anyway. So I was like, let's just leave it like it is and actually realize that it brings in revenue. And that's a good thing, from many people's perspectives.
But keep it separate from cannabis. We should not.
Yeah.
With the liquor.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and this is why I think not only should we not, I think we have the full argument that it's illegal to do that. You cannot combine them because it's federal prohibition. So that's why this separate agency or authority is the word. They operate, the employees are not state employees. There is really, it's a completely private entity, aside from the fact that, at least in the case of, the New Hampshire Business Finance Authority or the New Hampshire Housing Authority, if they do make a profit, it can go back to the state. But you can retain that money in its own, it's its own entity. Yeah.
So if I could, I'd like to step back just a little bit because you were talking about whether growers are interested in getting into the cannabis market. And in case you don't know, we did a survey last fall, worked with the Farm Bureau and NOFA New Hampshire, the organic group, and there was overwhelming support for legalization. But also, I think it's 78% of the respondents who were active farmers said they were interested in adding cannabis. But I would like to also go back to something Phil was saying about the craft cannabis, because I've attended expos in Burlington, Vermont, and Augusta, Maine, cannabis and hemp expos. And yeah, there's dispensaries, there's growers, but what I did not expect was all the other businesses, builders, security, insurance, HVAC. I mean, it is stimulating the economy a big time. And young people who are excited about science and about business and about opportunities because it's a free enterprise system. Tightly regulated, and they have some problems with how they're doing it in both states. Neither are perfect, but there's freedom, there's opportunity, and there's a lot of economic exchange happening of all kinds of businesses, not just the cannabis sector.
Yeah, I think something I didn't touch on too was, from what I know, I feel like at least Massachusetts is doing a lot of sort of BS bureaucracy with the way that they're, making the dispensaries and the growers deal with the cannabis in a way. They're treating it like it's, like nuclear waste or something. It has to
Like
be
it's still
tracked
prohibited.
Yeah, which I do not think that's how we should do it at all. I think we can learn from what Massachusetts and Vermont have done and say, hey, we don't need a bunch of, frankly, stupid hoops to jump through that aren't, we don't need to list a bunch of ingredients on the side that really have no effect, on the use or consumption of the cannabis. And I mean, one thing that I think, I have found is going to some of the dispensaries in Maine is sometimes you go there and they don't have anything that I want, So I think that New Hampshire really could offer, more products and better products, learning from what the other states have done.
Joe, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Hi. I didn't give you this ahead of time because it just came up in what you were saying. How tied are you to funding housing and cannabis and housing as far as funding, because a lot of the funding, the option proposals in the past, a lot of people say, "Oh, we want this, we want that," and they always get redone, and it's usually a mix of many things to keep as many people, in as possible. So what if housing wasn't even included, would you still be a supporter of legalization?
I mean, ultimately, I would if someone could tell me where that money is going to come from otherwise. If you look, UNH did a study, did a survey about a month or two ago and asked what the biggest problem in New Hampshire is. Housing was the top one by 38%. The next thing down was education at 8%. So there's really no other aspect of our state that needs the money more, I would argue. And even these other things such as education, by lack of housing, it's just causing our education to be more expensive. It's just the largest driver of inflation. So I think also, you spread the money around and no one actually sees any change because, you put a little in education, a little in housing, and then you've watered it down to the point where it's almost, no one's going to see the difference. But that said, ultimately, I want to get it passed. So I think, depending on how that was cut up, I would be interested in that. But again, if somebody had another way to fund housing, to the tune of 50 to 100 million a year, I'd be happy to hear that as well.
So I have a couple healthcare questions from folks that aren't here, and if we shall have time, if any of us that are here still have another question. So one of our board members, Carrie DeGrutis, is a patient advocate, and she said, "John, as a patient, I've experienced significant stigma and limited access to resources. How would you, as governor, improve access to medicinal cannabis, support the alternative treatment centers, or ensure my rights as a patient?"
Yeah, I was sort of not exactly sure what they meant by this and was hoping I could have asked some follow-up questions, but I mean, obviously we still run into problems with it being federally illegal in terms of what, for instance, insurance can cover, and that sort of thing. I guess all I can say is that I would do everything I could to ensure that patients have access to cannabis. And if I haven't actually, I don't know. I know that there's a lack of dispensaries up in sort of the North Country. So, if someone's having to drive more than 20, 30 minutes, I would be willing to expand dispensaries to allow, particularly medicinal patients to have, the easiest access that they could.
Just to follow up, if I may, Tim,
comment?
so just to help you out there. So obviously we saw they were going to tax medical patients. That's a bad thing. I think potentially some ideas for you, giving them a path for-profit status while recreational remains illegal might be certainly a thing. In our opinion, if they can pass the litmus test requirements, they should be guaranteed a recreational license, at least one each. So there's things like that I think you can do, because we have to be honest. In every state that's legalized, we do know that some of the patients just find it easier to go over and grab it from a recreational dispensary. I will tell you from personal experience, I have friends that could use a medical card in the state, but that conflicts with other rights that they have, and they don't want to lose those. So just some food for thought there, that there's a lot of ways just so we can make sure that first, it's viable, second, they're not taxed, and third, that more people can get access if they need it. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
And maybe educating law enforcement as well to help with the discrimination and stigmatization that we see everywhere.
Oh, okay. Was that what that was about? Okay, I wasn't sure.
And that's in another one of the questions. So so another one is from our board member, Austin Whittemore. He's a cannabis nurse at Dartmouth Medical Center, a former veteran. And he said research shows that cannabis can modulate the endocannabinoid system and thus impact our balance of health and wellness, whether it's used as recreational or medicinal. How can the state ensure the public is properly educated to support a safe patient or safe consumer-centered care?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the same way that we have, education on alcohol consumption, and we educate the public about not drinking and driving and that sort of thing. I would see the same thing happening with cannabis, where we're doing PSAs, and people have, there's literature available in the dispensaries to educate people about, what potential harmful effects do exist within cannabis, as, the same way with any prescription drug that you get, or, any non-prescription drug that you get, there's a little leaflet in there telling you, hey, don't take all the Tylenol at once, sort of thing. So I think definitely there'll be a little bit of education. I think that, I think the state, you would certainly have to put some of the money from cannabis into that sort of program, that kind of educational type information.
Yeah, I mean, to give you a point, and Phil can attest to this, in the state of Vermont, they actually put a hand card in every time that you buy in a dispensary. And I asked I made a sort of a joke with the dispensary owner that I know in Danville, and I said, "Oh, I don't need one of these." She goes, "No, I have to put it in there. I'm required by law to insert it into every time you buy a bag." Phil, did you want to comment? You're muted.
You're on mute, Phil. Oh, you're muted, Phil.
I'm unmuted. Daryl told us to make sure we were muted most of the time. I just wanted to comment on the education, the other part of it. I think Tim just sort of alluded to it. There are three of us here, Tim, Riley, and myself, who are educators, college level educators who teach cannabis studies, particularly in terms of all the things we're talking about here, but especially in terms of, young people, college graduates thinking about a career in some form of cannabis. And given what Jim was just saying about all the different, accessory occupations and jobs that go along with that, that would be another thing I think you might consider, sort of encouraging, the state university, community colleges, state colleges to, look into, teaching cannabis studies, business studies, et cetera, cultivation for potential workers in this, young people who might stay in the state of New Hampshire.
That's a great idea.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just on that same point, I think what we're missing a lot in the cannabis industry is the top-down approach of educating medical professionals so that they can help their patients more. Because we always try to target the patients, but the endocannabinoid system, understanding the pharmacology of CBD, THC, all the terpenes, all the other cannabinoids, the flavorants, the flavonoids, like it's a lot. It's not just like, hey, take this pill in the morning and it'll make you feel better. It's very, very complex. And I think the medical professionals want to know more about it, but they're not taught about it in medical school. So I think it's a really good way that New Hampshire could kind of show that we're prioritizing this, is to have free continuing education. Maybe it's not free. I don't know. I think it'd be good to be free, but continuing education for medical professionals so that they can help their patients more. The patients get less discrimination from their medical professionals, and everyone feels more educated to make these decisions about their health, instead of just saying, I don't know a lot about that, go to the dispensary and ask them. People want to trust their doctor, but doctors aren't the expert right now, unfortunately, in cannabis medicine.
That's a really good point. Thank you. I appreciate that, because I definitely, I believe the United States, and New Hampshire included, consumes far too many pharmaceuticals. And if cannabis could help us get away from that, the pharmaceutical industrial complex, I think that would be a very good thing for everybody.
And just using the language to talk about cannabis as a medicine, as the thing that has therapeutic value in our body through these known mechanisms. Like, we have 30,000 publications on cannabis and the ECS. We know how it works. We just need better communication and better education so people know it's a legitimate medicine and understand dosing and consumption methods and prior history, medical history, and making sure that all of that's considered when you take in cannabis.
Anecdotally, if I could just add, in our cannabis studies program in the Vermont State University, we're offering a course in medicinal cannabis this fall for the first time, aimed specifically at nursing students and other health science students. So, and that was requested of us by our nursing department in the system.
That's great.
So that makes, sorry, didn't want to let you, in case you had any.
Oh, go for it.
So I have two questions, one more on health, and then one that I think we'll wrap up with. So this is from Kyle Savage. He's our resident healthcare administrator and a cannabis entrepreneur. He said, if a legalized recreational cannabis model were come to fruition in the state of New Hampshire, what potential impacts do you believe it would have on the state from a population health standpoint?
Honestly, I do not actually think the amount of cannabis consumed in New Hampshire will change that much at all. And I've said this to a lot of people on the trail. I think most people that want cannabis are just driving out of the state to get it, or maybe growing their own. I don't know, but honestly, the only way that I think it would change is that I think there are some older folks who maybe are sort of, feel like it's still illegal, so they can't do it, who might be more inclined to eat an edible, to relieve some, medical issues. I know one thing from talking to my campaign manager has been a state rep for 10 years. So she's knows a lot of these people that, come and go through the state house. And, one conversation we've had a lot is that some of these older state reps and senators who were maybe against cannabis 4 or 5 years ago are now using cannabis, or their husbands or wives are, because of medical issues, and because they're like, oh, I'll pop over to Vermont and get it. So I really think we're seeing definitely a sea change in that. And I mean, if anything, like we said earlier, I hope to see a reduction in teen use. If that was, what we got out of legalizing cannabis, I think that would be great.
So I have one more question, but I want to make sure I introduce I asked her a question earlier before our fellow board member, Carrie DeGrutis. She was dealing with an unanticipated veterinarian trip. So
Happens.
So Carrie, in the video that were recorded, he did answer your question. So
I'll refer to it later. Thank you. I appreciate you.
so John, this is the last one, and really maybe you can answer it in a couple words as opposed to a long one. But this was from our Derek Anderson, one of our board members, who's in the construction and HVAC business, and he basically said, what role, if any, should the New Hampshire Liquor Commission play in the New Hampshire
Hold on a
cannabis
second.
industry?
I think I froze. Sorry, I think I might have frozen.
I
Hold
can
on a
hear
second.
you, but you visually you're frozen.
All right, now I can hear you. Sorry, I think something happened with Wi-Fi.
Yeah, so visually you're stuck, but we can hear you.
Yeah. You want me to ask it again? Is that what happened?
Oh, we just lost him.
Hold on. We'll see if he comes back.
Maybe he didn't like that question.
Video's freezing.
There
There we go.
I think
Should I ask it again?
Yes, can you repeat that?
Sure. It was, what role, if any, should the New Hampshire Liquor Commission play in a New Hampshire cannabis industry?
I mean, aside from us sort of looking at their model just in terms of the state being involved in the distribution of something. Let's just say that. Aside from that, I don't think that they legally can have any connection to it. I don't think that they should. As I said earlier, in a perfect world, we would not have a liquor commission. As a restaurant owner, I hate dealing with them. They have a lot of rules that they enforce that frankly are completely meaningless, and they don't even know why they're enforcing them. So I would not have those connected at all. It would be a complete new entity. Again, just copying the model of the fact that the state of New Hampshire sells liquor, so why couldn't we sell cannabis?
So John, real quick, you had shared with me their rule about 20 chairs. So maybe you should just open up a restaurant called 20 Chairs. For those of you who don't know, I guess you have to have 20 exactly for a certain license or whatever. So if you have 19, you're not allowed to open. So.
Well, John,
No, now Tim's freezing. So John, what he's going to say is, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate
Hey, it was a pleasure.
Yeah, we appreciate hearing the views on this. So Tim, you just froze.
Oh, I'm back. No, I was thanking John because we're out of time. John, thank you so much. We appreciate it. If you have any other questions for us, or any other responses that you want to give us, we're glad to do that. And as well, like we said, we're glad to share any of this material with you as you for your campaign efforts. Like we said, we don't endorse any specific candidate. It's more about making sure that we are helping educate the community about cannabis legalization in the state of New Hampshire, and we really do appreciate your time with us today.
Thank you,
Thank you
John.
so much.
Thanks, John.
I put my email in the chat if anyone wants to email me any additional information or anything that maybe we didn't touch on. Appreciate it, guys. Thank you very much.
Good luck, John.
Thank you, John. See you all for the next one. Bye.
Bye.